Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Wood, and I'd like to welcome you to our Owen Sound Waste Watchers event, Talking Dirt About Composting. Even though we are meeting online, we begin today's event with a land acknowledgement statement. We want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. The people of the three fires known as Ojibwe, Adawa, and Potawatomi nations. And further, we give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. I'd like to hand over today's hosting duties to fellow Owen Sound Waste Watcher, Lori-Ann Caswell.
Thanks, Laura, and hello, everybody. Before we get on to the main event of today about composting, here are a few little newsy updates. We've been tracking numbers of items we've picked up since the fall of 2018 when Owen Sound Waste Watchers started. This year, we're trying to get to the grand total of up to 250,000 items. We haven't tallied this week's pickup total yet, but going into it, we were already at 207,551. So congratulations, picker-uppers, and keep it going. Now, as for the pickup events, so far this year, in the interest of following public health protocols, our events have been apart and together, with Waste Watchers picking up apart individually, then coming together for a Zoom event. We're hopeful that by the August 28th pickup event, we won't have to be apart, and we can instead all pick up together, so keep your fingers crossed. Between now and our hopefully together event on August 28th, we'll have one more apart and together event. The week of July 18 to 24, we will still pick up individually, and then at the end of that week, come together for a very special and unique opportunity, Talkin' Trash Zoom event. So, on Saturday, July 24th, we're hosting a trash poetry Zoom event featuring Naomi Shihab Nye, U.S. Young People's Poet Laureate. She's a really big deal in the poetry world and in many other ways. Naomi is a dedicated trash collector, reuser, and recycler who just happens to write some amazing poetry, a collection of which is in her book, Poems for Our Time. We are absolutely thrilled that Naomi will join us to do a reading or two and share her story. And if we're hosting a trash poetry event, clearly we need Owen Sound's Poet Laureate, Richard Satosky, who we're very happy to say will also be our guest. To keep the trash poetry thing going, we'll be inviting folks to write and post a poem about trash for a chance to win a copy of Naomi's book. So mark your calendars now for July 24th, 3 p.m. and watch for announcements. So that wraps up the news and updates, and now the main event. Today, we're talking dirt about composting. And we have with us four very experienced and enthusiastic composters, each one covering a particular area of composting and a wide range of topics they are. Don Sankey will talk about traditional composting. Brian Wood tells us about living with worms. Ugh. Have to get used to that. Laura Wood shares her adventures with a Japanese method known as bokashi, and Teresa Pearson rounds out the composting talk from the perspective of community gardens. As I introduce them, you will realize, as I did, that each of these composters are quite different in their backgrounds, but all have come to this place and time where composting is very important to them. First up, we have joining us happily retired educator Don Sankey. Don had a lifelong interest in nature and has been a naturalist throughout his life and career. In retirement, Don is active with the Gray Sawbull Conservation Foundation, the Memorial Forest, and Hydro Conservation Authority. He is also involved with Grey Roots and is active as a schoolmaster for the schoolhouse in Morstan Village and chair of the Friends of Morstan Village. Don had a great career as a teacher and school administrator with the Grey County Board of Education and the Blue Water District School Board. He moved here to the Grey Bruce area back in 1975. And some of you may remember that pollution probe was big back then. And so were environmental studies. At that time, Don was teaching outdoor education to primary and junior classes, and that's when his interest in composting started. So Don, welcome. Take the stage, unmute, and away we go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm very impressed with your group. I've been following it, through Ann Finley. She's, the Owensound Hub. So traditional composting, as you mentioned, pollution probe, that started back in 1970. So when I first started teaching primary grades in Mississauga, and back then with Toronto Township too, I was doing outdoor ed and science in the primary and junior grades with pollution probe. And back then we had endless budgets. We had a lot of money and outdoor ed was very big. But I chose to move to Grey County because I just loved this area. My dad grew up in Hanover and I just wanted to come here and teach. And so over the years, I've had a great career. And so I've always felt, first of all, teaching the young children about the environment. And I'm very disappointed in how education has gone with environmental studies, but I'll leave all the politics alone for today. But I've always firmly believed a good administrator, good teachers can lead the way. And composting could be done in every school. I was able to do that in most of my schools. And as an administrator, I had so-called power to influence people. And one of my best the two schools were McPhail School with Fleshton Hills, and then Strathcona and Owen-Sound. And I'm very pleased to see how the old tennis courts became the community composting because when I was principal there, we worked with the city to try to convert that property into the playground. And then with Strathcona gone, I'm glad the community picked it up. So I'm a traditional composter. I firmly believe in dirt, and I see my role is creating dirt. And so some of the stuff you probably know and will, probably use. I use 2 composters. I'm hoping if you haven't purchased a composter, the city of Owen-Sound had been selling them. I'm not sure the status lately, but one of the secrets of to traditional composting is getting your home involved and having a system in the kitchen, and there's no sense composting if everyone doesn't participate. So my wife Susan and I, we just use a traditional a jug, and we probably put out every 2 days fruit, vegetables, all kinds of stuff into a composter. And I have a composter close to the house under the deck, and I've always warned people about raccoons and that, but I use it all year long. And then after about a year and a half, I empty that composter into another composter at the back of the yard. And beside that composter, I have a dirt pile. And the dirt pile is my secret. I think it's great to compost it, but what do you do with the mixture and mixing it? So by having the dirt pile, I constantly add to it. I add soil, sometimes when it's on sale. When I work in the garden, I put stuff into it. I sort of mix all 3 composters, the 2 composters and the dirt pile, whether it's dirt from the garden, leaves, grass cuttings. I try. The only time I go to the major composting outside the city is, in the fall with all the leaves and bags, and sometimes in the spring when I've cleaned up the mess from winter. So I try to recycle and reuse as much of the stuff in our property, and it works. It is beautiful. I'm hoping most of you love getting your hands dirty, getting your fingers into the dirt. It's amazing eggshells, how long they can last, and certain things. But I find by mixing the compost, adding stuff to it. So traditionally what I do is if I have about 20, 30 centimeters of compost, I then add some grass cuttings, add some leaves. Sometimes I add Pro Mix. And all during the wintertime, I add snow, I add junk to it, flowers. It's a constant flow. And then I move it to the second composter and continue to turn it over with a pitchfork, add stuff to it. And I add water too. And in my dirt pile, I found a secret over the years is to water it down. Water is very magical. It can break down the soil. It can break down leaves and decaying material. So I water our dirt pile 2-3 times a week, and I turn it over. And it is amazing. Within so many months, I've created soil, and I add that soil back to the garden. And then in the fall, when I trim the garden up or expand it a bit, I take that dirt and the mixture and add it to the dirt pile. So I'm constantly using that dirt pile as the final product. And it's amazing. I just love the feel of dirt. I love the magic of composting. I think the secret is you've got to keep at it and work it. You just don't let it do it by itself. You can allow it, if you leave it alone, it'll work. But if you pitchfork it, turn it over, add stuff, I even throw in some fertilizer, sometimes manure, just whatever you can find. And it works. And it makes that magic soil. And our gardens have really come alive because of the composting. When we first moved into town, the soil in the garden was more clay and it wasn't and dry. But with composting, the water holds. And I water my garden pretty well every day. I water the dirt pile and I continually to mix the soil. So the secret to composting, turn and mix and add. So in a nutshell, that's pretty well the basic composting. I think the rules would be you have to have one close by the house, especially if you're going to use it in the wintertime. You have to be careful of rodents. I know some of the complaints from people. The only rodent that I have to deal with is the raccoon, and I've outsmarted him sometimes, or she, with a couple heavy stones and binder twine or something. But it works, and then cleaning it out every year to move it to the second composting, turn it over, and then move it to the dirt pile. So if you don't have a dirt pile in your yard, I'd consider you trying to create one, because that's where the magic is, when you can add your compost and you can add your daily cuttings from the grass, and when you weed your garden, things like that. I think in a nutshell, Laura, that's pretty well the basic composting. The secret is to make soil and get your hands dirty. I'm open to questions.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Don. Well, you've certainly kicked off composting in a big way. I hadn't thought of it as magic soil, but that's really a cool way of seeing it. I think a lot of people think of who are not composters, see composting as something you're doing with household scraps, but it's really seeing it as soil. Laura, I know, calls herself a soil nerd, and I'm really starting to understand that now. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Our next guest speaker is Brian Wood, who worked on farms as a teenager, left Manitoulin Island for university, married Gloria, and raised a family that now includes 3 grown sons, their spouses, and 3 grandchildren. Brian had a varied career working in different business sectors: government, public accounting, construction, land development, healthcare, manufacturing. Some of those jobs took him to the US, Cayman Islands, Czech Republic, Malaysia, and of course, Canada. Gloria trained as a microbiology lab tech, spending much of her career as a music teacher. And by the way, she's really the driving force behind their gardening efforts. Brian and Gloria retired in 2014 and moved from Georgetown to Meaford. That year, Brian had a compound leg fracture from skiing and spent 10 weeks immobile in their condo. While bedbound, he explored many subjects on the internet and discovered that worm composting is a great way to reduce household waste and enrich gardening soil, as it creates a recycling circle where food waste becomes food for the earth that helps grow more food. So Brian, as I shudder just a bit,
Okay.
How about you tell us about the wonderful world of worms?
Okay. It's also known as vermicomposting, and it's a natural earth composting process. You accelerate it by using more worms than you normally find in soil. So the final product is known as worm castings or worm poop, or whatever you want to call it. It's not a process for squeamish people. As a teenager, I had farm jobs, and we had 3 young kids, so I'm okay with the stuff. Worm castings have a very high concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, so there's no need for synthetic fertilizers. It's great texture, allows the earth to hold more moisture, and reduces watering needs. The finished product can look a little bit like rich chocolate brownies or dark fudge, but I wouldn't suggest taste testing it. Most worm composting systems use red wigglers. They live on the surface rather than dig deep. They eat and excrete their body weight every single day, but they do remain quite small. Worm composting can come in different forms. So we have a picture here of how we do it in the community gardens. That's a bathtub somebody has brought in, and it's a very good tub design because it has an ability to have runoff into a leachate bucket on the right-hand side, because moisture is really the enemy of worms in the long run, but you need some moisture in there. The downside of it is that all the stages are mixed together, and you need to hand separate in order to get the castings. So again, you'll get your hands dirty. But there's a lot of greens available in a big garden. Now, unfortunately, you have to move the pile from outdoors to indoors during the winter. So that's the downside to it. And for our home use, we wanted to have something we could use 12 months a year. So we have a picture here of something called a worm factory. And in 2015, I bought this little apartment tower, which takes very little space. It's 1.5 feet square by about 2.5 feet high. Now, there was an Owen Sound seller that I bought it from. He came to my door, dropped off the worms, the instructions, and everything to my place. I tried it in the basement first, and that's not a good idea because some of the worms escaped. I had a fruit fly infestation. Other beetles came with the worms, and they escaped too into our finished basement. And it's not a lot of fun cleaning the unit in a finished basement. So very quickly, my wife persuaded me to take it outside. And we now keep it in a single car, semi-heated garage all year long. So I want to talk about the design here. If you take a look at it, there are legs, a bucket underneath with a tap, and at least 4 layers going up, and a top on the very top, which helps keep away the fruit flies. And what happens is you put kitchen scraps, and we'll talk about that as part of the stages, in the bottom area. And as you keep adding scraps, some of the worms, the energetic ones, tend to work their way upwards through a grilled layer in the bottom of each bin. Other worms aren't quite as energetic, and they stay in the bottom section. So over a 4-month period, you're really completing the entire design. Now, I have a pad and roller at the bottom. I took a kitchen countertop because it's getting heavier every year I get older in order to manage it. So the worms can live 4 to 5 years. So if you look after them and give them a good home, they give you great castings. And if I'm forgetful, the tower has instructions on the very top lid, which I can use as a refresher. So I use a 4-step process. And I separate the food scraps into 2 groups. Worm-friendly greens. That's not meat, citrus, or dairy. I cut them small and keep in a small compost bin in our garage. And we're very close. We're probably 20 steps from the kitchen to our garage, so it's very convenient. I put non-worm friendly scraps in a second compost bin in the garage, and that's things like citrus or other rough digestibles for the worms into that second compost bin. And when that's full, I take that bin over to our community garden hot compost pile and drop it in there. So it's never wasted. Now, step 2, every few months, I shred some community flyers. You know the flyers you get at your door and you have to get rid of? I shred them and keep them in the garage in a 3rd small bin. So there's only 3 bins that I use. And when the worm-friendly green compost bin is full, and that's step 3, I place the contents in the top level of the worm tower and add an equal amount of shredded paper. Over the time, the worms eat away and they migrate up towards the fresher food. So the bottom trays have the most processed castings. The bottom tray catches the moisture that runs down from green matter that hasn't passed through the worms. Now, that's not exactly food friendly because some of the pathogens that are in there, but you can mix it with water and fertilize the soil around the base of your non-food plants. So there is some benefit even to that part. Eventually, the top layer in the tower is full of scraps. You need to clean out the bottom bin and create a new tray for the new scraps. So we'll go on to step 4. So this is about the biggest job that you do once a month. It can take 1 hour in total. I do this cleanup process outside of my garage. I wear yellow rubber gloves and I roll the tray to the garage opening. So I've got lots of air and lots of space. And I get a lot of interesting comments from my condo neighbors as I walk by, since I'm sitting there picking out worms from a bin, wearing yellow gloves. So great conversation starter. So first of all, I move the lowest digested tray to the top and I allow the worms to migrate down to the next level. They're migrating away from the sun because they don't like the sun. And I have to pick out some stubborn ones by hand. And all I do is drop them in the open tray at the bottom and they dig down. So I take the worm castings from that bin and I put it in a bucket for garden use. When I'm done, the top layer is empty and ready for more greens. The other bins are now one step lower in the process. And so it takes approximately 4 months to go through all the different layers. So it's not a big deal because, as Don said, every day you contribute to your input areas, and once a month for 1 hour you sit down and deal with it. You mix the final compost with the soil and you dig it into gardens for long, slow release to the soil. It works for most crops, but you have to be careful. You have to know your soil, because if you aren't careful, you can over fertilize the soil. It's great for leafy greens in a raised bed, but not so good for radishes and things that you tend to keep in more sandy soil. You can also make what they call worm tea, brewed from the final compost. Gardeners call it liquid gold to top dress the plants and to make plant leaves and stems more pest resistance. You do that by putting a bag of compost in a jug of water and activate it with different things like molasses, but that's a different topic. But the beauty is that it creates an invisible coating on the stems and the leaves, according to some articles. And if you take a look at all the damage that different pests do every year, it's nice to be able to minimize that. So I want to show you 2 more pictures. One here is the very top of my bin, looking down, and you can see the shredded stuff and the semi-digested stuff down below, but you can also see the coffee that we drink each morning with the filter, and the greens. You can see the banana peels that go on our breakfast, and all that's cut up in the kitchen. I just take it in there, and I usually put it in the bin. For the purposes of this demo, I wanted to show you what the greens look like. Now, after about 4 months, there's another picture that I've got showing what it actually looks like. So there's a big difference between the 2 pictures. You take a look at that and you can see the little worms that are left in the final bin. The ones that were too lazy to go up stayed down there and kept working. And so they're the ones that I'm separating in the sunlight, and they work their way back down again. So the casting texture is very small by this point. So it's ready after you take the worms out, and some worms remain in the compost if you make an error. It's not a big deal because the worms replicate they double in population about every 90 days. So you can get quite a pile. It's much more active than the normal soil. So in conclusion, the gardening has been a kind of a learning experience for us. We've learned the anatomy of worms and how they contribute in their own small ways. And it's amazing to watch dirt turn from inert dirt, construction type soil, into good soil. And so it's also our way to help our environment. Minimizing waste starts with our buying choices. We prefer to buy food grown locally to reduce the carbon footprint and help the local farmers. We first bought beef, chicken, fish, and fruit locally. But a couple of years ago, we became vegetarians, and this increases our garden green volume quite a bit. It keeps the worms busy and probably creates too much worm compost, which I share with neighbors in the community garden as well. So I want to show the last picture here. Meaford has curbside pickup, and they pick up the compost every single week, and they compost it, which is probably something that other towns don't do, or they go and sound it. We can use that service, but why give our greens away when they can be helpful to our own gardens? Our compost bin is rarely used. Over the last 3 to 4 years, We've not collected enough grains to fill this small bin even once. So to me, it's you have to be a bit active, you have to be a bit of a scientist, you have to understand them, but you get tremendous manure. So that's really our story about how we live with worms.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
I think I'm starting to understand now why you sent me a document. I think it was titled something like, I've got worms, you can too. I have to say, worms are still icky to me, but you've inspired me. Thanks very much, Brian.
Well, you know, it's an interesting conversation discussion with strangers who walk by. It's an interesting conversation with strangers as they walk by the cleaning process.
Oh, I think that's true.
And it gives you a good chance.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks very much, Brian.
Okay.
Our next guest speaker is Laura Wood, founder of Owen Sound Waste Watchers, so will be familiar to many of you, if not everybody, and who just happens to be Brian Wood's little sister. Born in Sudbury, Laura spent her teenage years on Manitoulin Island and worked most summer mornings in her parents' almost 1-acre garden. And she hated every moment of it. After school, Laura moved to Toronto, where as a busy marketing executive and mother of 2, gardening really didn't fit into her busy routine. She was thankful that a small inner city property didn't require much maintenance. When Laura and her husband Jack retired and moved to Owen Sound, she discovered she had more time to get out into their garden. There she has come to love digging in the dirt, a common theme today, and creating useful, nutritious soil through both traditional and bokashi composting methods. That's bokashi she's going to talk about today. So, Laura, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori-Ann. It's my pleasure to speak with you all today about bokashi. But actually, in reality, it isn't composting at all. Rather, what happens in Don's outdoor composting bin or Brian's word tower, that's composting, but the bokashi method is actually fermentation. What you are doing is turning your food scraps into pickled kitchen scraps. Once the food waste is fermented, it's then combined with soil for the composting process to begin. Bokashi fermentation creates lots of wonderful microbes, yeast, and fungi, all really important ingredients for healthy and productive soil. So why add that extra step of bokashi? Well, unlike traditional bin composting, you can add all of your food waste to the bokashi process. Yep, that means you can add dairy and meat solids, cooked or raw, bones, grains, pasta, fruit and vegetable scraps, or anything that's gone a little off in your fridge. In 2020, the National Waste Characterization Study showed that 23% of what goes to the curb here in Canada is actually food waste. When that goes to landfill and decomposes, methane gas is produced, a potent greenhouse gas. Also, when bokashi is used to produce food waste, that means your garbage will no longer be smelly and attract the wrong kind of party guest. I can tell you I don't miss those morning surprises when I would discover a raccoon had made a meal out of the garbage put out the night before. So how does the process work? Well, earlier you saw a photo of the 2 bokashi pails that we use in our household. And here's a bird's eye view of what's inside the pail. Food scraps are collected in our kitchen for a few days, and then I add layers of food scraps and a few tablespoons of fermenting bran. You want to make sure that the excess air is removed, so I use a repurposed plastic shipping envelope and a wooden press that Jack made with a convenient handle. But if you don't have something like this, you can just reuse a plastic bag and put a large plate on the top and press down. Over time, the liquid from the food scraps will flow to the bottom, similar to what Brian was talking about. And every few days I collect this liquid using the tap on the bottom. It smells a bit like vinegar, and this is called bokashi tea. Sounds familiar, and it can be used in one of two ways. We can pour it down your kitchen drain to help remove buildup. Or you can do as I often do and dilute it with water and use as a natural fertilizer around the base of indoor plants or garden. I use a ratio of 1 part bokashi tea to 100 parts water, so it's quite diluted. After the pail is full, I let it sit for 2 to 4 weeks. Now, we usually wait until the next pail is full, and that's an average of 4 weeks in our household. After that, it's time to introduce the fermented material to soil for the composting cycle to actually begin. So here you can see that in the fall, we dig 1-foot trenches in our 2 raised garden beds. Throughout the winter, that makes it easy for us to add the finished bokashi to the trenches and cover them with about 6 inches of dirt. In the summer, I actually add the bokashi to the active side of my 2-bin composting unit. The fermented material breaks down really fast, and I think that the fermenting bran actually speeds up the process. So here's the good news. Pests do not dig into either the ground or the compost bin because they don't like fermented food waste. Who knew that raccoons didn't like pickles? After a few weeks, it's safe to begin growing food. In our case, I stopped adding the bokashi waste to our raised beds in early April, allowing the acidity levels to reduce well before the spring planting begins. It just needs a couple of weeks. So to wrap up, I love using the bokashi method as part of our routine to eliminate food waste from the bags that go out for pickup. Well, it does cost a bit at the beginning to purchase or make the pails, and then around $50 a year for the bran. That is offset by the reduced number of City of Owen Sound garbage tags we have to purchase. We are delighted to know our food waste is not contributing to harmful greenhouse gases in landfill, and those garbage bags are safe from those neighborhood pests. Bokashi also helps to create great soil for our garden, helping to build optimum soil structure. Every time I bury some bokashi or harvest gorgeous soil from my compost bin, I think of my late father, Ron Wood. Despite not enjoying all that work in his garden when I was younger, I remember his pride when he showed me his new composting bin that he'd cobbled together, made from scrap wood. Like him, I take a lot of pride in what I have become, a true soil farmer. Well, that's it. Thank you for letting me share my bokashi experiences with you today.
Oh, thank you, Laura. I think bokashi is something that is really new to quite a number of people. So hats off for being an advocate. I think of apartment dwellers who just can't, I mean, they'd like to compost, but there's no means to do that. And this is a viable alternative. I wait for the day when Owen Sound has curbside pickup of organic material, but until then, this is a viable option. So thanks very much. Last but definitely not least is Teresa Pearson. Now, Teresa has a social development studies degree with a specialization in social work from the University of Waterloo. She has worked in the field of social services for 40 years and has been employed with the CMHA Grey Bruce branch for the last 11 years. She is the program manager of psychosocial rehabilitation programs, group services, the ID clinic, Fresh Roots Cafe, catering, and the garden programs. Her passion is celebrating the awesomeness of people and building strong, resilient community. And that's where we land today, as she tells us about composting in the CMHA community gardens. Teresa, it's your turn now.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited about what I've heard already today. So great. Just trying to figure out how I can implement all these wonderful ideas. we have been gardening at our one major space that we garden at is in Owen Sound, and it is many people may know it as the abandoned tennis courts and the old lawn bowling space by St. George's, if that helps orient people. So 10th Street, 4th Ave area is where we have sort of taken over our growing. We'll continue to grow. So on the abandoned tennis courts, we have 42 community garden beds. We have 54 beds, and each of these beds are 4x8. And I'm telling you this so you'll get an idea of exactly how much material we can get for our composting. We have 54 raised beds that I employ people with mental health experience to garden. That is one of my passions, is employing people. So we grow produce to help with OSHARE. We have a brunch program. We have a catering program. We are in the home stretch of opening our Fresh Roots Cafe. And it was some years ago that some of our gardeners really began expressing a love and an interest in composting. And so maybe we'll go through the pictures now, Laura, if that's okay. And I just took some pictures to give an idea. So there's one of our raised beds. And so this is how it sort of starts, right? We're cleaning up and weeding a bed, and then we can go to the next. So we sort of use the ratio of 3 brown to 1 green as our ratio in our compost bins. So if it's stuff like a lot of big, heavy stuff, we have a corner where we would put it. The stuff that you see on the right would be for next year's composting. So on the left, we would definitely be using that for this year's, and we try and cut it up. We try and speed up the composting process, because honestly, we have the most beautiful space for composting. Tennis courts get hot. It is hot there, and we can go to the next picture. So all of our community gardeners, they have an agreement that they go over, and no one is, well, I use terms like you're strongly encouraged not to use chemicals and to have organic practices. And I support people if they have pest problems. We go through all kinds of, whether it's diatomaceous earth, whether it's hand picking off bugs, etc. So all of the waste that would come from their beds, they put them in one of these 3 open air containers, and it's from there that we take the material, and then we can go to the next picture. And that's what it looks like after less than a year. So what we are doing is we're layering. So we're layering brown and green. Also, I'm terrible with names, the First Gentleman traditional composting. We also we'll throw in compost with the layers, and dirt that we have in there, and eggshells and cotton, everything. We just, and rather than watering, we just, if we know there's rain coming, if we go to the next picture, okay, I'm looking for the picture that has the whole, that's what it looks like at the end after we have, so we are, yeah, there we go. So there's the whole row of, if we know it's going to rain, we literally just go along and take all those lids off. So we have 10 containers there. Some of them we did buy from the city of Owen Sound, and some people just called us and said, look, I have an extra one. I drove by, or they've walked the labyrinth, because we have a edible labyrinth in that space as well. I have an extra one. Would you like it? Absolutely. I will never turn down a composter. So we will just go along if we know it's going to rain, and we'll take all the lids off and catch all the rain from a rainfall. So it gets super hot there, and our system is really simple. When it's done cooking, and we bring the wheelbarrow up, and we will literally pull that right off of there, and we have a screen. We made a wooden and a metal mesh, and we set it over the wheelbarrow, and people filter it, and we end up with that beautiful compost on the left there. And yeah, they're so proud, and literally so much has been trial and error, and they have watched different YouTube videos, and it's employment for folks. We have had, and some of the things that I speak of were pre-COVID, and I would really hope to see us getting back to that, where businesses in the community called, individuals. Is it okay? It drives me crazy putting my compost in the garbage. Can I come and put my compost in your compost? So pre-COVID, we had people had our code. We have a real estate punch pad code, and people would just come and drop off. Obviously, we had conversations about what could be put in it, because we have zero raccoon and any kind of pest problems. And they would just come in and drop off their compost when it was convenient for them, and it just added to our gold, right? We just call that gold, what we have there. So with COVID, we have not been able to do that. There was number restrictions. The health unit has really guided a lot of our what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. But for our folks, being able to work with the community gardeners and work with the community and have those meaningful relationships and learn so much from each other is invaluable. We are constantly looking for ways to make money. So my hope is to be selling the compost. It is ready to be sold. But again, it's about traffic. It's about how I just bought from Uline some of the burlap bags. They're not burlap. They're like what you would use if there was going to be flooding. I forget what that material is called, but just bought some of those so that people could come and buy some compost. Community gardeners have been buying it for their beds. So really see endless opportunities of how community could be more involved with that. We have people that bring us coffee grounds and eggshells. We have 18 beds where the food forest is. Like literally, there are so many ways that community could be involved in this, and education, right? I mean, with the food forest hopefully opening back up next year, that's a space where the community comes and harvests food and just has fun on Saturday mornings. What an amazing space for, and that's why I'm thinking worms and all those different, like, can you imagine how much kids would love like watching that sort of a thing and picking through worm poop? That'd be like their dream. Okay, probably not while they're harvesting veggies, but I really see opportunities for them to look at something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's just, there's so many different opportunities, I think, for education in a gentle way, you know, that really interweaves all, and yet we can also, we need to make money, right? I mean, for amazing things, this whole garden program works because CMHA is the mother of it, right? And oversees, and I'm a paid employee that has X amount of time to give to it. But the reality is you can only write so many grants, and eventually you run out. So you've got to find those ways, right? So anyhow, so that's, I mean, the community component is really a starting point. I think we've just scratched the surface of what we can do with that, and look forward to the ways we can work together.
Oh, Teresa, that's terrific. I mean, your work with community gardens, certainly in the capacity you have, is really remarkable and inspirational. And I loved your focus on education. That's certainly something that's really important to Owen Sound Waste Watchers, hence today's event. So thank you. And indeed, a great big thank you to everybody, to all of our amazing guest speakers today, to Don, Brian, Laura, Teresa. We've all learned a lot, and I think it's safe to say that you've inspired us to compost one way or another. So thank you very, very much. And now that we've heard from all of our guest speakers, we still have a few minutes, so maybe we've got time for some questions. I'll kick it off because one of the questions that one of our participants sent in had to do with bokashi. So Laura, this one's for you. Does the bokashi method of composting produce methane gas? You mentioned that when you were talking with related to landfill. So how about with bokashi?
So, you know what, I wondered that too, because the bokashi method is a low or very little air process, so it has the same potential. I'd have to say in my digging, very little research has been done on this, but here's what I've found. I found that the microbes within the bokashi bran suppress putrefaction and the methane producing microbes, dramatically reducing greenhouse gases that are produced. Okay, so in simple language, when you compost with bokashi, you are fermenting organic waste at a very low pH level because of the bran that you add. Methane producing microbes can't survive at low pH, so very little methane gas is produced. So that's the textbook stuff, but I'll tell you from my own experience, I've also noticed that the top of the pail is not extended at all by a buildup of gas. So that gives me some comfort that I haven't become a greenhouse gas producer.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you. I was really curious about that. It was a good question. Does anybody else have a question for one of our guest speakers today, or a comment about your own composting experience?
I have a question.
Okay, Carol, shoot.
And this is just for all of the speakers. It sounds like this takes time and work. Everyone's passionate about it, but for someone starting out new, what would you say to their concern or their comment, I don't know if I've got time to compost? How would you respond?
Good question. Okay, who wants to take that first?
I'm happy to start the answer to that.
Go for it.
When we were living in Toronto, they introduced a composting program where you put all of your food in, all of the food scraps. And so it made a lot of sense. The big plus was you weren't getting animals getting into your garbage. So we learned to have a little container in our kitchen that we would put stuff in, and then we move outside. So it was kind of a two-step process. We learned to do that. As far as composting, it probably, once you get it set up, for me, the traditional stuff outside probably takes me about 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes at the most, every couple of days. I take it outside, I have my stuff there, I layer it, put a little bit of water on it, shut it, go back into the kitchen and start over again and collecting. And then I would say it probably takes twice a month. It might take, I would say, half an hour to an hour, depending on whether you're harvesting or not. And I know, Brian, you mentioned the time as well. But here's what happens is it becomes a hobby. And it's actually a very rewarding hobby that probably takes the least amount of time of all of my hobbies. So that's my answer to that question. I would encourage everyone to start because you really get hooked.
Brian, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, from my perspective, I don't think it's a huge extra investment in time. You have to take your garbage from your kitchen somewhere. So dumping it in 3 or 2 pails is not a big deal. And adding it to the worm tray probably takes 5 or 10 minutes every couple weeks. And to spend an hour outside is not really a hardship, as I sit there, chat with neighbors, and just enjoy the day. So as Laura said, it becomes more of a lifestyle in that it's rewarding to measure how little you dump at the curb. And in looking at that, it's also great from a knowledge sense because you learn so much about the soil, the conditions, and that's really where gardeners come from. They need to understand all that in order to manage their own flowers or food. So it's not a huge additional effort to do it.
And it
Again,
sounds like
though, it all depends how you feel about worms.
Jack, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to mention a lot of the speakers touched on how they do their composting, but I didn't really clearly hear the, Laura has a very specific system of layering. I heard Teresa talk about the ratio of brown to green and stuff, but I've heard people who aren't composting, one of the biggest complaints is animals. And what we've learned is if you do that layering properly, it really gets rid of that animal problem. And it's, so I don't know, maybe Laura or somebody wants to talk about what the proper layering is, but Laura's got a little system where she's got a bunch of shredded leaves, a bunch of dirt, and it's all set up out there, so it's all very easy to do.
Well, I think you basically described it, Jack. I know Simona is here as well, and she's in the community garden in Meaford, and we've had long conversations about pest issues. And we have not encountered any pest interest issues so far, because when we put our green organic food waste in the outdoor, I always put a layer of a thick layer of leaves, which I shred in the fall and I have ready for the entire season, and then a layer of old dirt on the top, and then I pat it down. So, I didn't mention that when I put the green in, I actually fill up the container with water. So that's when I water it. I don't water it after that, and that actually helps me clean out the container. I'm putting some water in it. It slides easily out of the container. I put the leaves, the dirt on the top, pat it down, put the lid on top, no problems. Now, we also have lined the inside of our composting bin with a wire mesh. So that may help because we do have spaces between the slats. We want the air to be circulating, but we put a wire mesh in it. I'm curious about, I'm going to put Marg on the spot here. Marg is a participant from previous discussions, and she was talking about the fact that she's going to start composting. And in her area, the pests are a little bit bigger than in the city of Owen Sound. So I'm curious, Marg, whether you've had some visits from larger pests.
And so what Laura's talking about is the black bear in Tobermory. We have, on the peninsula, we have population of black bears that are threatened, but we do see them here frequently. So I was worried about starting composting because I thought that I would be attracting black bear. And Laura and Lori-Ann both, encouraged me to consider composting. And if I do it right, then I won't have this problem. And you're right, I have had. I did start composting, and so I'm very new to this, but I haven't had any large animals. We have fishers here as well, fishers and raccoons, and I think the fisher initially tipped over my composter, and we've resolved that issue. We don't have a lot of soil to be able to anchor the composter into the ground, so we've found another way to do that. And so our problem has been solved in terms of medium-sized animals getting into the composter. And in terms of the black bear, he or she hasn't been attracted to the composter yet. So I think that your advice is working. So thank you very much.
That's great. And it is often, Jack, thanks for bringing it up, because from the comments we get from other people who are curious about starting composting, the biggest hurdle is their worry about getting animals. So it's encouraging to know that it really can be avoided. If you're doing it right, animals just aren't interested. They find other sources for their food. So I'm really conscious of the time, folks. We're now at the 4 o'clock mark. We're happy to continue if anybody has additional questions. Any thoughts, comments you want to share?
I had two quick questions. One was, because we don't have a lot of deciduous trees here, what can I do to substitute the layering of deciduous leaves in my composter? And then I have a question for Teresa, asking if you're associated with the food bank. If the food bank, I know in some areas, will purchase seeds and materials needed for community gardens, if the gardeners then return the fresh produce to the food bank, and was wondering if that was a relationship that you had started yet. So those are my two quick questions.
Okay, Teresa, maybe you can take the second part of that.
Actually, in our community garden setup, I provide seeds and plants as needed to community gardeners. And part of what we do with our 54 beds is I reach out to OSHARE, who does meals for the community, and ask them what I can grow for them this year that would be of benefit to them. Because a lot of the people that are growing produce in their community garden beds are in need of that produce. So we don't have, like people would offer, right, if they have extra of something, but we do the growing of extra produce, and it's through communicating with OSHARE or Salvation Army, but primarily OSHARE, because they're doing fresh salads, and so I bring bins of washed greens, etc. But I do provide seeds and plants and that sort of thing if people need it to get their gardens started. So
Cool, thank you. I like the idea of asking what these folks would want. Why grow something if they really don't have a need for it? I got so excited about that, I forget, Mark, your first question. What was it?
Layering, what can I do to substitute?
Oh yeah, when you don't have deciduous trees, right. Any alternative to lots of leaves? I'm thinking about my 75,000 trees on my lot, thinking you can have mine. Come and collect them. Anybody have some answers for that? Those who are doing
I noticed that Simona has raised her hand, so I wonder if she would like to answer some of these questions.
Well, one of the suggestions I have for Mark, sorry, one of the suggestions for Mark, definitely it could be shredded newspaper or cardboard. It doesn't necessarily, if you don't have necessarily leaves, then sometimes people use also shredded bark. That's another option that I would suggest, but maybe the most easiest would be the shredded newspaper or shredded cardboard or any kind of dry stuff, even I think pine needles can work as well if it's not overly too much. Yeah, so this is my answer to that. But I wanted to show you, I did home style bokashi last year over the winter, because going outside where it's 2 meters snow. So I created a bucket. I've seen it on YouTube, and I started my bokashi at home in the garden. It was easier going high, minus 20 snow, and I dump and clean up so the smell is not too much in the house. And I really, really enjoyed it. It was super easy, a huge bottle from, recycled from Home Depot or Rona, whatever, these big pile. And what I did, I made a holes in one of them, and I double it with another one. So I was collecting water, whatever was dripping over.
I think we lost her.
I think we just lost Simona.
Yes, but it's an interesting idea. One of the other things with, before I started doing bokashi, what I was doing was I was collecting just the green stuff that I would put in the composting bin, and I would wrap it in newspaper, and then I put it in a bin outside, like a plastic bin outside, and it froze. So in the spring, I went to my composting bin and I just dumped the whole thing of green waste into the composting bin, layered it with stuff, and it broke down so quickly. It was amazing. Now with bokashi in the winter, you could actually freeze it and wait for spring to bury it into the ground. But what we do is we have raised beds that have covers. So we actually dig the holes before the ground freezes, cover it up, and literally hike out to those raised beds and empty it in during the winter, just because I want to keep using those 2 pails.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's the only reason why I'd ever go out to that area in the middle of the winter. And you only do it every month. So it's not a huge hardship. And then I stop, as I mentioned before, about April, let everything settle. So it's got a couple weeks to work its way through the soil, and the acidity level goes down, and then you can just grow stuff right on top of it.
You also keep dirt inside so it doesn't freeze.
Yeah, that's true. I learned that the hard way. When I take the dirt out of the trenches, I actually bring it indoors. So I have my pile of dirt to go out to. I mean, I am a soil nerd, so I get my kicks from doing this sort of thing in the wintertime. But you could very easily just, plop it into, let's say, another container or plastic bag, stick it outside, let it freeze, and then just do it all in the spring.
Does anybody else have any other questions or thoughts or comments? Sounds like it's a wrap then. So I would just like to say thank you to everybody. This has been a really fascinating discussion. So especially to Don and Laura, Teresa, and Brian, thank you so much for contributing to this really interesting adventure today in composting.